Heb dich zur Sonne über dem Marsch der roten Kolonne. Sang der Gesänge, heb dich zur Sonne über dem Marsch der roten Kolonne. Land sei bereit.
Hello, and welcome to What's Left Up North. This is going to be the main YouTube outlet for the Communist Party of the Chequamegon Bay Region. I'm Elise Cayley. I'm a communist, and I'm running for City Council in Ashland Ward 6. This is Andrew McInnes, acting president of the Ashland Socialist Rifle Association, and my editor plenipotentiary. I'm a history geek, and that explains why he's the one who uses the modern technology. Also expect frequent visits from our beloved chairman, Councilman Wasaya Little Otter Whitebird, and any other local activists we can find who are willing to geek out with us about anything from labor movement history to redistricting reform. Alright, so today we're going to be looking at the work of two extraordinary musicians who survived the worst atrocity in human history, the Holocaust. Ernst Busch, a queer German communist, and Lynn Jaldati, a Dutch Jewish communist. We're going to be talking about how they process their experiences in Nazi captivity, examining their music, and how it fits into communist perspectives on what fascism is and how to fight it. We're going to be trying to answer four main questions. One, how did these two artists, Busch and Jaldati, treat their experiences as Holocaust survivors in their music? And two, what were the limits of early official narratives of the Holocaust put up by different countries, namely who gets left out, and what are the differences in Eastern and socialist interpretations of the Holocaust from Western ones? Then we're going to get into the personal experiences of how did Busch and Jaldati interpret what had been done to them and their communities, and leading that to the fourth and final question, which is why did these two survivors decide to live and work in the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, after liberation? Which someone from a Western perspective is probably going to be very surprised about that. So, before we begin, I want to especially credit several sources in particular. We will have a full bibliography in the notes, but a special thanks up front need to be given to Dr. Sarah Nyman for her book Learning from the Germans, Dr. Jean-Michel Palmier for his work Weimar in Exile, while he probably doesn't agree with a lot of my conclusions, Dr. Joachim Voigt for his biography of Ernst Busch, and finally to the Berlin gay community for keeping the memory of Ernst Busch alive, not only as a survivor, but also as a gay icon, despite that side of his life being completely ignored by mainstream historians. So with that, we're going to get into talking about the musicians. First, Ernst Busch. He was born January 22nd, 1900, and died in 1980. They called him the Dove of the Barricades. His voice was just... He really represented, on record, the early 20th century German labor movement. He became a prominent cabaret singer, actor, and communist activist in the Weimar era. He performed anti-fascist music in exile in the Netherlands, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and Spain. He was finally captured by the Nazis in 1943. He survived being held at the Moabit facility after he was liberated by the Red Army during the Battle of Berlin, and lived in the West for a while, but moved to East Germany as soon as the new government was founded in 1949, and continued performing, and he won the DDR National Prize for Art in 1956, 1966, and 1979. Really an extraordinary artist, and we're going to get more into just what he went through and the people who helped him, but that's just some basic background on him. He was also a native Platt German speaker, and he learned High German to record, which means that his voice, when you hear it, ultra crisp, formal Prussian officer's voice, and that coming out of a brilliant little Weimar twink is really a cool combination. Now we're going to get to Lynn Jaldati, 1912 to 1988. She was a Dutch-Jewish singer and historian of klezmer music, and she joined the Dutch Communist Party in the 1930s, inspired by communist support for the Spanish Republic. She went underground in 1940 because her country was occupied by the Nazis, and she was Jewish and a communist, and she went around holding secret concerts in fans' basements and just keeping these songs alive. The Nazis got her in 44 in the same same roundup where they went after some far more famous friends of hers, the Frank family. She survived Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, actually becoming one of the last people to see the Frank sisters alive before Anne was killed. She, likewise, after living in the Netherlands for a while after liberation, moved to the DDR in 1952 and won the National Prize for Art in 1960. That's some general background information on these two artists who we're going to be looking at. So right now, let's discuss a bit about how people in the United States tend to view the Holocaust versus how people in the Soviet Union and their allies viewed it, and how those of us who are socialists often still view it to this day. Just a clarification in terms, when we say Holocaust here, we're referring to the murder of approximately 11.5 million people and enslavement of millions more by the Nazi regime for political rather than military purposes. While we are going to be including the 3 million Soviet prisoners of war who were executed in the Holocaust because they were Soviet as opposed to Western Allied, we're including that. That's how we're getting the agreed upon 11.5 million figure. The first thing you got to understand is that when the Western Allies occupied much of Germany, they didn't even release all the prisoners from the camps. They encountered people who were in there because they were queer, because they were communist, and so on, and they thought that was totally cool, so they let the camps keep running, rather than, actually arresting the Nazis and dealing with it, which they did in small amounts. On the positive side is that the Western Allies were a lot better about specifically acknowledging the overwhelming loss of Jewish life. We say 11.5 million people were killed, and that's true, but the majority of them were killed because they were Jewish, and that is the central thing about the Nazi genocides. When the American-backed West German government was established, not only did they liberate the camps, they also paid reparations and saw that reparations were paid not only to Jewish survivors but also to the state of Israel for geopolitical reasons. The United States and our allies and most scholars in our territory have completely ignored LGBT experiences until very recently in the Holocaust, and also those for people who were in there because they were communist. Quote, "The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum unequivocally rejects efforts to create analogies between the Holocaust and other events, whether historical or contemporary." End quote. This is certainly good at acknowledging the central experience of the Ashkenazi Jewish people of Eastern Europe and the overwhelming loss of life, human rights, and dignity that they suffered. At its worst, this argues that the Holocaust was so unique that it doesn't necessarily bear analysis, which is something that we really are going to get into today. The TLDR is that until recently, the Western powers only recognized part of the Holocaust, and our sources tend to depict it as a unique event and a uniquely Jewish experience. This is largely because the Holocaust was also anti-communist and homophobic, both of which won the approval of the American authorities. The criminal code in Germany was retained after the war. Homosexuality was still illegal in both Germanies. East Germany quickly decriminalized it with full legalization following in 1960s, and we'll get to that. West Germany effectively decriminalized it, but it remained illegal in many states because West Germany was a federal republic. The last of these to legalize homosexuality was West Berlin in 1994. So still 9 years before the United States legalized homosexuality, but compare that to the East German record and the queer rights of West Germany. Not very inspiring. Now we're going to look at how Eastern Europe in general and East Germany in particular responded to this quite a bit differently. So the different communist view, first of all, is that when East Germany was being rebuilt, these were people who had either narrowly escaped 12 years of Nazi captivity or people who had somehow survived 12 years of Nazi captivity. And that might well have colored people's opinions as to whether or not they actually wanted to work with Nazis. First thing is that the East had a much more extensive hunt to bring former Nazis to justice. According to Dr. Nyman's research, for every Nazi who was convicted and actually served time, much less was executed, in West Germany, 6 of them were convicted and served time in East Germany because they actually thought this was unforgivable, and also they weren't staffing their government with former Nazis. On the downside, much as the West centered the experience of the Jewish victims at the expense of everyone else, the East really centered the experience of political prisoners, which they generally had a very different experience than the others did. For example, the first round of victims of the Holocaust were the Reds and the gays. However, the camps that they were sent to were much more holding, torture, and extermination through labor camps. They were not the outright killing factories that were used later, which is how you got some people surviving there for 12 years. And again, these were relatively small groups out of the 11.5 million. Important, but part of the point of this is that any fixation on one particular group's experiences is going to do us a disservice when we're trying to really get to what it means that 11.5 million people were gratuitously murdered. That said, there was one really cool thing. Despite the fact that they centered the experiences of the political prisoners, the DDR paid reparations to all survivors, as well as to the Eastern European countries that Nazi Germany had invaded. So they took it pretty seriously. They recognized this was something that they had to deal with in good Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, working off the past is the German term for it. As we mentioned previously, the DDR leadership began campaigning openly for LGBT rights by the 1960s, with major improvements in our ability to access housing, education, transition-related care. This was really, really important stuff. Oh, and also there was really cool propaganda songs about gay rights, but that's for another day. That said, DDR media sources didn't generally acknowledge the queer experience in the Holocaust itself until fairly late in the 80s, nor did they do a lot of public talking about specific queer needs in contemporary society. This was part of a view of struggle of progressive political forces against fascism, and the defeat of the Nazis was the greatest triumph in human history. I don't think many people will question that, but it does make relatively little room for the discussion of human suffering. It was a very costly victory. Even outside of the Holocaust, 25 million Soviet citizens were killed in the war. 11.5 million people were murdered just because the Nazis could, to say nothing of how many millions more spent some part of a 12-year span in absolutely hellish conditions just because the Nazis could. They could get slave labor. They could torture people. They could get their citizens all riled up and excited about the exterminations of so many people. Just portraying the defeat of the Nazis as the climax of the human struggle, at its worst, can get to the point that if the Holocaust was simply an extension of what was already happening, maybe it doesn't bear special commemoration, and I think that's pretty limited too. This is the single greatest mass killing operation in human history, and this is important to everyone, certainly to anyone trying to build a working class society where this sort of thing will never happen again. Dr. Nyman's work here really is seminal, and I recommend her book heartily. Again, it's called Learning from the Germans, and it's one of the best English language sources that I've worked with here. She is a Jewish-American philosopher who spent a lot of time living in Germany, and she really describes the contrast between the Western focus on the tragedy and the human suffering of it, and the Eastern focus on the eventual defeat of Nazism as a human triumph. That's really going to be informing a lot of what happens as we're getting into the music today. Because yes, this is ultimately a thing about music, and I promise we're getting to the end of the exposition soon. This is serious stuff. I want to make sure that we're provided with the appropriate grounding and context. Before getting into the music, we're going to talk a little bit about fascism and how this happened. In the wake of the Nazi seizure of power in Germany, the Comintern, the Communist International, commissioned a comprehensive study and report on what fascism was. This report by Georgy Dimitrov was the leader of the Bulgarian Communist Party, wasn't he? Bottom line, terrific socialist theorist. His work is the central radical guide to resisting the ultra-right to this day. The organization that I am a part of, and Andrew is as well, Communist Party USA, relies heavily on Dimitrov's philosophy and interpretation of fascism to tell us how we've got to fight against it. So, without further ado, is Comrade Dimitrov's analysis of fascism and how it emerges. First is that, as you've probably observed, even under liberal democracy, the bourgeoisie get most of what they want. For example, putting private property behind the reach of the ballot. We've got it in our Fifth Amendment in the United States that no person can be deprived of property without due process, which makes establishing public property very difficult. That maintains the power of the rich and limits the power of the rest of us. There are things that we can't do with our votes. Most of the ruling class is going to go along just fine with this system because they recognize it benefits them more than it benefits anyone else. But what happens when a part of the ruling class feels threatened? When they are no longer sure that they can maintain their power by winning elections, rigged or otherwise. That's when you get fascism, what Dimitrov defines as the openly terrorist dictatorship of the most right-wing faction of finance capital. Which is to say, when big business decides that it can no longer win by playing by the rules of bourgeois democracy, it decides to change those rules. They'll generate a lot of far-right populist upsurge to support it, although we need to be aware that fascism in this interpretation is first and foremost an action by the extreme right. An example of this in context would be that while the insurance companies were getting everything they wanted under the Obama administration, for example, even the tiny and completely inadequate moves that the Democrats were making on climate change were viewed as a very serious threat by the oil companies. They've continued to support far-right candidates with the goal of overthrowing whatever democratic limits there are on their power. Dimitrov is making a few assumptions about fascism here, some of which I think are pretty well justified. One, this presupposes a split in the ranks of the ruling class, and that suggests that the way to fight fascism is actually with a cross-class alliance, that working class organizations should work together in unison, but also work alongside our ordinary class enemies, namely those bourgeoisie who stand to gain the most under the preservation of the status quo and do not want to lose their nice tidy profit margins to the uncertainty of a fascist uprising. That is certainly one way of looking at it, and it's probably the only practical one. Whether it's adequate, well, we'll be getting to that for this whole evening. So, generally speaking, fascism will sell itself to the masses by embrace of national symbols and by giving full support to popular racism and sexism. That said, for all of the overall focus on, oh, the white working class is voting for the fascists, well, yes, too many of them are, but the main source of fascism's mass support is not actually from the working class, it's from the petty bourgeoisie, the small businessmen, the ones who cannot compete with big capital and are therefore always on edge and always looking to preserve their social standing and their relatively high standard of living. However you look at it, the average Trump voter made about $40,000 more per year than the average Clinton voter. So while yes, we have a lot of work to do at making sure that our class siblings are not supporting their own exploitation and the rest of our extermination, whether it's because we're black, we're queer, whatever, we also have to be aware that most of this is coming from the small businessmen. So, Dimitrov holds that this should be fought by an alliance between a workers' united front, working in combination with farm laborers and sympathetic businessmen, even capitalists, and this organization is called a popular front. And since fascism is inherently violent, seeking to topple the remnants of liberal democracy and replace them with rule by terrorism, it needs to be fought using all available means. It is worth noting that there is another school of thought. 10 years before Dimitrov was writing, the German feminist and communist activist Clara Zetkin wrote her view of fascism in response to the emergence of fascism, or what we recognize as fascism, for the first time in post-World War I Italy. And her view, in contrast to Dimitrov, which is to say that fascism is a response by a threatened ruling class, fascism is actually a response by an empowered ruling class. When the socialist movement has failed to win the support of the people, and when there's no credible way out of the suffering that people's lives have become, then people will just turn to thuggishness and cruelty. Fascism is a symbol of the death of the working class's hope for a better future. Depending on my mood and my serotonin level, I definitely go back and forth between these two views, but I just wanted to outline them a little bit. The first thing we're going to start with is musical responses to the rise of fascism. This one is Rosen auf der Weg gestreut. Literally, paraphrase, that would be rose petals at their feet, cover their path with rose petals. It's by Kurt Tucholsky and balls. As you might gather from the title, it's perhaps somewhat satirical. It is far better known by its refrain, "Kiss the Fascists," which it has proven ineffective. These people were able to see this even then, saying that, oh dear, you can't offend the fascists, you can't cancel them, they'll make them so upset. The song is Ernst Busch saying, yeah, let's go right ahead and coddle them up to and even after the point where they stab you in the gut, because, well, that's what we're supposed to do, right? That's how we're all polite and living together in this pluralistic society. I should tolerate the people who want to kill me. No, I shouldn't. So, some basic political information about the background is that the Nazi Party had consolidated the German extreme right by the late 1920s, mostly, and the League of Red Front Fighters was formed to resist the Nazis and to protect targeted communities. The Rotfront, as it was called, and the Communist Party that it protected were both strongest in Berlin, while the Nazis were, of course, strongest in the south of Germany, in München and the surrounding state of Bavaria. During this period, under a really visionary leader, Ernst Busch, the Communist Party became the first queer-positive, first pro-choice political party in any Western country to win elections, while openly calling for the legalization of homosexuality, a woman's right to choose, and a lot of other things that are really, really important to building a safe, unified working class. These ideas have gone from fringe to mainstream in the space of 15 years because of an amazing activist community. This song that we're about to hear is their response to what happens when Nazis show up, and being told to just be patient and let them do their thing. No, we've got the memory stick here.
Ihr müsst sie lieb und nett behandeln, erschreckt sie nicht, sie sind so zart. Ihr müsst mit Palmen sie umwandeln, getreulich ihrer Eigenart. Pfeift eurem Hunde, wenn sie ankläfft. Küsst die Faschisten, wo ihr sie trefft. Wenn sie in ihren Sälen hetzen, sagt ja und Amen, aber gern. Hier habt ihr mich, schlagt mich in Fetzen und prügeln sie, so lobt den Herrn. Denn prügeln ist doch ihr Geschäft. Küsst die Faschisten, wo ihr sie trefft. Und schießen sie, du lieber Himmel, schätzt ihr das Leben so hoch ein. Das ist ein Pazifistenfimmel, wer möchte nicht gern Opfer sein? Und spürt ihr auch in eurem Bauch den Hitler-Dolch tief bis zum Heft? Küsst die Faschisten, küsst die Faschisten, küsst die Faschisten, wo ihr sie trefft.
I have my flash drive in my pocket. I do not use my boobs to store digital information. However, if anyone knows how to do that, please contact the chapter, because that will help us a great deal. That is a pretty good example of the Karl Popper view, that tolerance is not a moral precept, it is a peace treaty. Tolerating intolerance will not end well. So no platforming fascists isn't a newfangled fad among campus SJWs, it has a long and proud history and philosophical justification. If you treat someone peacefully who is trying to exterminate you, the peace and tolerance will end. So, now we've covered the background of these artists and the political situation that was forming in Germany. The German communists get a lot of blame for not forming a league with the Social Democrats, but it's not clear to me what they could have done differently, given that the SPD, that's the Sozialdemokratische Partei Deutschlands, or Sozis, or SPD for short, the SPD had ongoing efforts to assassinate communist leadership at home and to isolate the USSR abroad. You can't really blame Thälmann and Setkin Republican for not being more cooperative. The Sozis had taken power in 1918 as part of a deal with the military. The price for taking power in that deal was that they signed off on the assassination of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. That would be like the equivalent of Trump allowing Biden to take office on the condition that his first act be the assassination of Bernie Sanders. You can kind of imagine what that effect would be on cohesion among people in the street and such. Due to betrayals like this, the communists felt isolated and persecuted by the moderates. This leads us to the struggle song against fascism. It was composed, like many songs on this list, by German Jewish communist composer Hans Eisler, with lyrics written by Erich Weinert, and ooh boy, it's spicy. This song was instantly banned when it was published, so in late 1932, Ernst Busch took a tour of the Netherlands to broadcast into Germany illegally from over the border.
Wer zahlt das Geld für Hitler und seine Kompanie? Das sind die Großprofitler der Kanonenindustrie. Ihre Parole ist der Arbeitermord, sie singen vom blutigen Tag. So wär, du Arbeiterherr, so laut zum Gegenschlag. Weg mit dem Schwindel der eisernen Front, den Betrügern am Proletariat. Und gilt nur die rote Einheitsfront von Arbeiter, Bauer und Soldat. Heraus aus dem alten Wahnen, die Einheitsfront marschiert vorbereit. Unter der roten Fahne, die Sichel und Banner führt. Es schreien die Reformisten, der Hitler darf nicht zur Macht. Doch wer hat den Faschisten die Bahn erst frei gemacht? Sie bringt Verbot den roten Frontkämpferbund, doch niemals die braune Armee. Drum Kampf angesagt, vom Teufel gejagt, die Führer der SPD. Weg mit dem Schwindel der eisernen Front, den Betrüger am Proletariat. Und gilt nur die rote Einheitsfront von Arbeiter, Bauer und Soldat. Heraus aus dem alten Wahne, die Einheitsfront marschiert vorbereit. Unter der roten Fahne, die Sichel und Hammer führt. Und Thron des Hitlers Horden, der Kampfbund steht bereit. Dann ist es Schluss mit dem Morden, dann kommt eine andere Zeit. Wenn wir im Bund mit der Sowjetunion den Henkern das Handwerk gelegt und die einige Kraft der Arbeiterkraft die weiße Front verschlägt. Denn mit dem Schwindel der eisernen Front den Betrügern am Proletariat. Die rote Einheitsfront von Arbeiter, Bauer und Soldat. Heraus aus dem alten Wahne, die Einheitsfront marschiert sturmbereit. Unter der roten Fahne, die Sichel und Hammer führt.
Okay, let's talk about that. First of all, how great is that opening line? Who pays the bills for Hitler and all his company? Why, it's the great profitlers of the cannon industry. So, as you probably gathered from the lyrics, it seems actually more about censuring the moderates who appeased the fascists and, by listening to their cries for law and order, ended democracy in Germany. Much more about saying, how the fuck did you let things get this bad? We can discuss how productive this was at that point, but it's certainly morally justified. And the point is that if the liberal elite devoted a fraction of the effort they spend on smashing working class movements to suppressing fascism, there would never be another genocide, another coup, etc. Just as the Carter administration failed to act when then-candidate Reagan made his deal with the Iranian terrorists, Manuel Azaña refused to arm the unions of Spain, and Barack Obama actively prevented the prosecution of the war criminals who would later rally behind Trump, centrist priorities like this make us rather a bit angry. Ernst Busch returned from his tour in January of 1933. Hitler was appointed chancellor by Hindenburg, the man who had just defeated him in the presidential election. Within days of Hitler's swearing in, his henchmen staged a false flag attack, blowing up the Reichstag building, and the enabling acts were passed, giving Hitler dictatorial power, which was then confirmed in a sham election. What this meant for our heroes is that within a fortnight, they had become criminals. Tailman was arrested, beginning what would ultimately be 11 years of solitary confinement and torture before his eventual execution. The first concentration camps were opened for mass roundups of communists and queer people. Anyone who was gay, Jewish, or a socialist had to run. The Prussian state government had a comprehensive database of anyone who had applied for a cross-dressing license, which was the means by which homosexuality had been quasi-legalized in Prussia. What that meant in practice was that the police had their targets identified, and the police had their numbers massively expanded by the stormtroopers. The stormtroopers were deputized as assistant policemen, which tripled the number of police in Germany. With that going on, the early camps like Dachau, Bürgermoor, and others filled up really quickly. Eva Zimmerman would later say that the only good Germans were in exile or in the camps. She and Ernst Busch both left, refusing multiple attempts to recruit him for propaganda work. Ernst Busch snuck across the border into the Netherlands, and that's where we're going to find him in our next episode. I really hope you're enjoying learning about some of the most important music in German history. We're really enjoying talking about it. Please give a like or support us on Patreon. Links are in the description. Until next time, roll at the front, comrades.